Hi everyone, this is Kimberly Ward. I help people to transform toxic stress and trauma so they can live a life that they love. Now, I recently posted an article on social media about a scientific study showing that trauma memories can be passed down to as many as 14 generations. There was a whole lot of interest in this article, and I think that's probably because so many people suffer from trauma symptoms like adrenal fatigue, anxiety, and depression. In fact, 40 million Americans suffer from anxiety, and about 16 million Americans suffer from depression. It's a lot of us. Inherited trauma could be the cause of these symptoms for some people. Now, this study was done on worms, and clearly humans are not the same as worms, but this study is so interesting to me because it demonstrates just how long these trauma memories may last. Now, we haven't been able to study the genetic expression of that many humans as of yet, but scientists have shown the impact of environmental change like stress and trauma can be passed down to at least children and grandchildren in humans. Now, we've seen this in the descendants of Holocaust survivors as well as in the Dutch famine of 1944. And I'd like to explain this very complicated topic in very simple terms for you. Now, this is definitely an oversimplification, but hopefully it's helpful. The experience of trauma does not change the genetic code, but it can apparently change the expression of our genes. Now, this is called an epigenetic change. The body is designed to remember experiences so that it's better prepared for similar future experiences. And it will respond to traumatic events by turning on or turning off certain genes. Then it can remember the experience in the genes for future use. So this trauma memory can be passed along to future generations. Now, we used to think that our genetic blueprint was our destiny, and now we know that our biology is greatly affected by our environment. I was first introduced to this concept back in 2005 by Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's a brilliant man who wrote The Biology of Belief. And he teaches that our physiology is fundamentally controlled by the physical and the energetic environment with very little contribution from our genes. Now, through Dr. Lipton and other scientists, we've learned about epigenetics, which really simply put is the mechanism that turns on or off our genes. Now, environmental factors including stress and diet and toxins all play a big role in gene expression. In other words, the environment can turn on or off the good genes, and it can also turn on or off our bad genes. And this is great news because it means we're not victims of our genes. We can make changes in our environment that can affect the expression of our genes and ultimately improve our health and well-being. So what is trauma? Trauma occurs when you're in a really stressful situation that you can't resolve. Once your body senses a threat, it's the autonomic nervous system takes over to help you deal with the situation by secreting stress hormones and other chemicals in a process that we kind of casually refer to as fight or flight. And the body can only handle this fight or flight state for a very short period of time because it takes so much energy to be in this state. And if the problem isn't fixed fairly quickly, then the freeze mechanism sets in, and that helps us to conserve energy for survival. In the state of freeze is what happens when animals play dead to escape their predator or when the human body goes into shock after a big injury. Trauma is the point where you can't say no to a situation and you can't resolve it either, so your nervous system gets overwhelmed and it shifts from that state of fight or flight into freeze. So this stress management system is a really tightly regulated process that's connected to all the other symptoms in the body, including your cardiovascular system and your immune system. So severe stress and trauma can lead to the dysregulation of stress hormones that can then ultimately lead to dis-ease if it's left unresolved. Everybody reacts to traumatic situations very differently. I tell my clients that trauma lives in the system, not in the event. And a particular event could be severely impactful on one person's system, and for another, it only causes minor stress. So what are the factors that determine how we respond to stressful situations? So here's a list of some of the things that can affect our response to stress. One is the perception of the event. Did I find it stressful or not? The outcome of the event. Did it get resolved or not? Was there any help available for me to resolve the event? In fact, the amount of support and social connection I have in general in my life. Also, the amount of stressors, because compounding stressors impact our ability to cope. And then there's the level of our overall health, like hormone balance and gut health and diet and exercise. And there's toxins, toxic foods, toxic chemicals, and even toxic people and relationships. And the amount of trauma in a person's childhood, known as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short. And then, of course, there's genetic and inherited or generational trauma. Some people are born with highly sensitive systems that are very easily dysregulated due to the experiences of their parents or their grandparents. Their ancestors' stress genes were turned on because of trauma, and those epigenetic changes were then passed down to them. And these highly sensitive children are much more prone to negative effects of stress and neglect in childhood and later in life if they don't have a nurturing environment and were not able to build resiliency in their system. Now there's a doctor, Dr. W. Thomas Boyce. He writes about highly sensitive children in his book called The Orchid and the Dandelion, Why Some Children Struggle and How All Can Thrive. Now he calls highly sensitive children orchids because, like orchids, these kids take a very specific and highly nurturing environment to thrive. And in contrast to the dandelion children, who are much more resilient, they can thrive in more challenging situations like the hardy dandelion plant that can grow virtually anywhere. The dandelion kids are less sensitive and less reactive, and they tend to be more often extroverted, and they're more comfortable with novel situations. And they have average health in both low stress and in high stress situations. But the orchid kids are much more sensitive and they're more reactive. They're often more shy and they withdraw from novelty. They have lots of sensory sensitivities, and these children have the best or the worst health depending on their environment, the environment that they were brought up in. These highly sensitive children, they're much more prone to the negative health effects of neglect and stress. But if they grow up in a nurturing environment, they tend to have better health outcomes. So again, they either have the best outcomes when reared in safe and nurturing environments, or they have the worst health outcomes when brought up in high stress environments, or in other words, when they have a high number of ACEs. So remember that the environment is the key to the expression of our genes. And to be clear, not all highly sensitive children have inherited trauma, but it is something to keep in mind when we're trying to understand our own stress patterns and when we're supporting others with their trauma symptoms. Because I find that it can be so easy for us to pass judgment on these highly sensitive people, and we think of them as weak-willed or as being too delicate. But understanding that their highly sensitive systems could be a result of an inherited trauma may help us to have more compassion and more patience for these people and more patience for ourselves if we're highly sensitive ourselves. There are many different signs and symptoms that result from trauma, and here's a list of the most common symptoms that I see in my clients. Low tolerance for stress, anxiety and or depression, difficulty forming and maintaining healthy relationships. They're often dissociated and checked out, or they can be overly reactive and overly emotional. There's exhaustion, adrenal fatigue, and chronic fatigue. Often I see gut and digestive problems, hormonal imbalances, and also there's a lot of chronic disease and chronic pain associated with trauma. For a longer list of common trauma symptoms, you can see the link that I have in the description below. So how do we heal trauma? Well, working with inherited trauma is often the same or very similar to the process of healing from our own traumatic events. Now, this is because the past event that created the trauma symptom is not as important as what is happening in the system now in present time. Remember that trauma lives in the body, in the system, not in the event. But since there can be so much shame around having a sensitive system and living with the symptoms of trauma, many of my clients have been relieved to know of the possibility of inherited trauma being at the root of their symptoms. Now, trauma messes up your body's coherence. Coherence is when the body's systems are all working together in harmony. In this state, there's increased synchronization between the cognitive, the emotional, and the psychological symptoms. This is where your body and your mind come into alignment. Coherence promotes healing and creates a sense of wholeness, which is your natural state of being. So whether it's our own trauma or the trauma passed down to us from our ancestors, it disrupts our natural state of coherence. So besides the fact that we're not victims of our genes, the great news is that building resiliency and returning to a state of coherence after trauma is totally possible with the right tools and right support, regardless of the trauma source. Now, there's so many things we can't control in this world. We do have some control over our environment. So learning how to adapt the environment to promote healing and build a more resilient system is part of the healing process. And once we do this, we can pass down this resiliency to the next generation. So my goal is to educate people on the effects of stress and trauma and to offer simple tools and techniques for healing. So for more information about how trauma impacts your health, you can click on the link below and get my free online course that explains this in great detail. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful and useful.